I used to live deep in the backwoods of Pennsylvania, right near a set of train tracks hidden within the forest. About once, sometimes twice a week, I'd hear the mournful sound of a train horn tearing through the silence, always at different times. Sometimes it would be early in the morning, other times late in the evening. Occasionally, it would wake me from a dead sleep in the middle of the night. The little house I was renting was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by a thick grove of trees, though I wasn't sure where the train tracks actually lay. Since they didn't run through town, I was convinced that the sound was coming from somewhere in the woods. The longer I lived there, the more my curiosity about that mysterious train grew. It probably sounds silly, but I've always liked trains. Even though the train horn would sometimes startle me, it was oddly comforting. Each time I heard it, my ears would perk up, and I'd find myself tracing the sound as it moved, trying to pinpoint exactly where it came from and where it was heading. Eventually, after about a year, I decided to take one of my days off to go find those elusive tracks. I packed a few bottles of water, some snacks, laced up my favorite walking shoes, and practically skipped out of my front door. It reminded me of being a kid. Back then, I didn't have the best home life, so it wasn't unusual for me to pack a bag with enough supplies and comic books to disappear into the woods for the day. The forest was my escape, my sanctuary from the anger and yelling of home. Out there, it was always peaceful and quiet. It made me feel safe in a way I couldn't get anywhere else. As I walked out my back door that day, I was reminded of those childhood adventures and how much I loved the freedom of those woods. I'll admit I was expecting to feel just as safe and enchanted as I did back then. But oh, how wrong I was. The forest was serene. The silence was broken only by the occasional bird call or the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was an early spring day. The earth was soft from recent rain, and dew glistened on the tall grass. As I made my way through it, I headed in what I guessed was the direction of the train horn, with no particular plan other than to find those tracks and enjoy the breeze as it played with my hair. After about an hour, I finally found the tracks. I let out a joyful whoop when they came into view. I raced forward like an excited kid until I stood right next to them and then began walking alongside them toward the distant mountains. My parents had always told me not to wander near train tracks, but I'd always wanted to follow them just once to see where they led. I kept walking with a spring in my step, not noticing the sun sinking lower in the sky. I was so lost in my thoughts, wrapped up in the thrill of fulfilling a childhood dream, that I didn't realize how late it had become. When I finally looked up, I noticed that the shadows had grown long, blending together into one big pool of darkness. Realizing the sun was setting, I turned around, following the tracks back with a quickened pace, hoping to get back before nightfall. I had almost reached the spot where I thought I had started when a figure appeared in the twilight ahead. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked entirely gray, like a smudge of ash on the horizon, slowly growing larger as it came closer. Something about it unsettled me, though I brushed it off, assuming it was just the natural apprehension of being a woman alone at dusk. I stepped off the tracks and moved through the woods, emerging in a neighborhood close to mine, and finally made my way back to my house, exhausted. The encounter with the figure didn't stay in my mind long. By the time I woke up the next day, I'd nearly forgotten about it. It was a few weeks before I found the time for another walk in the woods. When another lazy day off rolled around, I packed my bag and slipped out the back door again. This time, I left earlier and headed in the opposite direction, thinking I might end up in the next town over. I figured if I went too far, I could always take a taxi home. This time I took a can of spray paint and marked a tree near the tracks with a huge blue X. I wanted to be sure I could find my way back. I can't say for sure, but that mark might have saved my life. Once again, time seemed to slip by. As I walked, before I knew it, it was late afternoon, and I decided to turn back. As I did, I noticed a gray smudge on the distant horizon, just like before, slowly approaching me. The sun was still up, so I didn't feel quite as unnerved as the first time. I assumed it was just another person taking a quiet stroll along the tracks. I kept walking, admiring the trees on either side of the tracks and the towering purple mountains up ahead. I was lost in the beauty of the landscape when I glanced back and realized that what had been a distant smudge had now taken on the shape of a person, just a few hundred yards away at most. I studied him as he got closer. He wore a gray three-piece suit and gray shoes, with gray hair slicked back neatly. In one hand, he held a bag, a large white trash bag, almost like the heavy-duty kind you'd see for construction waste. It sagged and shifted, as though filled with liquid, yet he carried it with such ease that it might as well have been full of helium. At first, I didn't feel any fear. It was a beautiful afternoon, and I was in a good mood. I've always been friendly, so a part of me was even a little excited to meet what I thought was a neighbor out for a walk, just like me. But as we drew close enough to greet each other, a wave of nausea hit me. It was like every sense I had went numb, leaving only a gut-wrenching feeling of revulsion. Despite the edges of my vision graying, I forced myself to keep walking, hoping I'd make it past this mysterious man, and closer to home. As we passed, my senses snapped back to normal, and I took in a terrifying detail. Even his skin was an ashen shade of gray. He faced forward, but somehow his face twisted and melted in my direction. His features stayed clear, but it was as if the skin behind his face was dripping, making the face itself slip toward me. He gave a slow, eerie smile, revealing gray teeth and the hint of a gray tongue inside his mouth. He passed by, and I exhaled deeply, struggling to calm my rioting stomach and frayed nerves. I wanted nothing more than to collapse and let my panic out, but I pushed on, determined to reach home. After a few minutes of walking, I managed to rationalize the encounter, telling myself I'd imagined it, or that maybe he had a medical condition that made him look that way. Just as I convinced myself to dismiss the experience, I saw something up ahead, a gray smudge on the horizon, coming closer again. I debated for a moment, then turned around, hoping he was still behind me. Nothing. There was no trace of him, not a single sign he'd been there at all. I faced forward again, and somehow he'd managed to close nearly all the distance between us in the brief second I'd looked away. My heart pounded as I forced myself to keep walking, insisting to my now terrified brain that it was just a coincidence. Or maybe I'd spaced out longer than I realized. As we closed the distance, I plastered on a brave smile and managed to call out, "Hey there, didn't we just see each other?" His expression didn't shift. Neither did his pace. When he was close enough, he opened his mouth, and in a voice as flat and gray as a tombstone, he replied, "We'll be seeing a lot of each other." His smile stayed locked in place. As mine faded, my pace quickened, desperate to put some distance between us. As I passed, a smell wafted from the bag he carried, and it took every ounce of self-control not to retch right there. The stench was like pure death, flooding my mind with visions I'd never conjured myself. War-torn battlefields littered with bodies, people torn apart by animals, corpses left to decay, eyes staring blankly into the void. I slapped a hand over my mouth, trying to block the smell, and hurried on. Though the nausea lingered, all I wanted was to get home, to collapse in the safety of my favorite chair. But I was still at least an hour away. I glanced behind me, reassured to see him still moving in the opposite direction. Relief washed over me, until I turned back to see another gray smudge on the horizon. My stomach dropped. I whipped around to confirm. He was no longer behind me, but he had vanished completely. With a feeling of resignation, I turned forward again, already knowing what I'd see. Sure enough, the gray man was there once. Again, his gray smile visible, even from this distance. I swallowed a sob, frantically scanning the area around me, trying to decide if there was any way to escape him. Between the tracks and the trees was a thick stretch of tall grass and weeds, easily waist-high. I'd have taken my chances, running through it, but I have an intense fear of ticks and the thought of bringing any home made my skin crawl. As he drew closer, I weighed my options. Either pass the unsettling man one more time or risk picking up a parasite. After a moment of inner debate, I took a deep breath, braced myself, and stepped into the tall grass, breaking into a brisk walk. Against my will, I glanced back at the tracks, half expecting him to be watching me, but he wasn't there. He must have done his little disappearing trick as soon as I stepped off the path. I smiled in relief and faced forward again, but the relief shattered instantly as I stumbled back. He was there, standing directly in front of me again with that same stone-like, gray-toothed smile. He kept walking forward, his gaze fixed on the horizon, fist clenched around the bag. I froze, just staring at him as he passed by, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Something inside the bag sloshed heavily, and the stench of blood and death hit me with a force that made me feel sick all over again. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping this would all somehow vanish, But when I opened them, the gray man was still there, his back to me as he walked away, his pace unchanging. I watched him walk until the long shadows of the evening began to blur his form, and he became a distant gray smudge on the horizon. When I turned to keep walking, I let out a resigned sigh. Somehow I wasn't surprised to see that same gray smear up ahead once more. I tried convincing myself it was a trick of my imagination, a coincidence. But as he approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in real danger. Part of me screamed to get away, to run, yet I shoved that warning deep down, ignoring it in favor of getting home. The gray man was there no matter what I did, so I reasoned I might as well keep following the tracks. This time the smell hit me first, thick and suffocating, like decay and old blood. I gagged, blinking back tears as I held my breath. The man drew closer, and when he was about 10 feet away, something about his smile shifted. He didn't exactly move, but his lower jaw seemed to stretch downward, as if his face was melting, the jaw slowly sinking lower and lower until it hung nearly at his chest. Then his eyes met mine, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. As he passed, his jaw was grotesquely low, but his eyes stayed locked on mine the entire time. As soon as he was behind me, I bolted. My only thought was to reach home before night completely fell. Up ahead, I spotted the bright blue X I'd painted on the tree. I veered off the tracks and ran through the grass, not caring about anything, but getting to safety. But as I ran, my vision started to blur. The shadows of the trees around me took on strange shapes, turning an unnatural shade of gray, and then I saw it, a figure in front of the tree with the blue X, slowly morphing into the gray man, his bag swinging as he approached. I stopped, waiting, until he was only a few feet away, and then sprinted to the side, crashing into the tree line. I tore through the woods, ignoring the branches scratching at my arms, focusing only on avoiding the gray smudges. That seemed to appear out of nowhere, taking on his form faster and faster. By the time I saw my house in the distance, the gray man was practically beside me, that horrific smile frozen on his face, the bag swinging from his hand, the contents sloshing with each step. I didn't look back. I dashed into my house, locking the doors and windows, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered out. The shadows outside seemed to move, to take on the shape of a man, before melting back into the darkness. I left Pennsylvania not long after that. Whatever charm it had held for me was gone. But when I lie down at night and close my eyes, I still see him, the gray man, always on the horizon, coming closer each night. And somehow I know someday he'll catch me